I gotta say, this is awful that Diddy owes his life to Mark Agnifilo, literally his life, because he could have gotten life in prison were it not for Mark Agnifilo.
You can always tell when someone who thought they were untouchable suddenly tastes fear for the first time. It hits different. It changes the way they move, the way they talk.
His defense lawyer, who had a brilliant strategy, and Diddy screwed him over when he hired this videographer to chronicle his life without telling Mark Agnifilo that when Diddy and Mark were on the phone, this videographer was recording what Mark clearly expected to be an attorney-client privileged relationship. Now, it is true that the client holds that privilege, the lawyer doesn't, but Mark's clear expectation was that this was a private conversation. These were private conversations, and that he and Diddy could talk openly, and Mark could talk to Diddy not just as a client, but as a person, and tried to guide him in a time leading up to his arrest. And unbeknownst to Mark Agnifilo, Diddy has got this guy recording the conversation as he's sitting there saying, "You are screwing this up. You are messing up this case. We're losing." And knowing that that's on tape. And it's almost like he's performing for the camera and not telling Mark what's going on. And the really enraging part about it is that Mark Agnifilo won this case for Diddy with legal strategy. It wasn't just an accident that this jury that had heard all of this in the news before the trial voted not guilty on all the serious charges. It was Mark Agnifilo that did that. Yet Diddy secretly records this guy and embarrasses him. And yeah, you could say, well, Diddy never expected that it would end up being broadcast somewhere else. Well, okay, but Diddy was planning on using it, or he wouldn't have had it recorded in the first place. So it's just really, really unfair. And I know that in a way this sounds crazy, that I'm getting so upset about Diddy, and yet there's video of Diddy beating Cassie. Well, that's horrendous, but that doesn't mean you can't look at something else as well. And I just think, as a lawyer, I just think this is just so outrageous that he would do something like this, and not even understanding what Agnifilo's legal theory was. Because I will tell you that when we did our first documentary on Diddy, which was 8 months before the trial, Mark Agnifilo said to me on camera that he is going to tell this jury that this was a successful black man that prosecutors were trying to take down because they couldn't get into his bank accounts because they were clean, and he couldn't deal with they couldn't deal with taxes because he wasn't committing tax fraud. So they go into his bedroom. And that's what Mark Agnifilo said 8 months before. And he goes into the trial and he essentially wins that argument. Whether you believe it or not, a jury that sat through the whole thing, they believed it, and ultimately they convicted him on this BS Mann Act thing. So Diddy won that case. And one of the reasons he won the case is something that Agnifilo got criticized for. That when he did the documentary with me, he was making a joke about the baby oil. Remember, he said, "Oh, well, you know, I didn't know he bought in bulk. He must have bought 1,000 bottles at Costco." And a lot of people just slammed him for that and said, "How dare..."
The way they look around a room like every shadow might be carrying the next blow. And that's exactly what's happening right now as the figure at the center of a growing, suffocating storm slips deeper into panic mode, scrambling to hold together an empire built on intimidation, secrecy, and silence. But the silence isn't holding anymore, the walls aren't holding anymore, and the people who once stood guard aren't standing guard anymore. Because the lawyer finally walked away. Not quietly, not gradually, not with a strategic fade-out or a carefully worded transition. No, the lawyer stepped away with a message so loud it shook the whole landscape, The cases have gone too far, too deep, too disturbing, too dangerous to touch. And when the one person trained to navigate the darkest situations decides the darkness is too much, you know it's bad, you know it's catastrophic, you know the spiral has begun. From the outside, the figure still tries to project control, quick statements, forced confidence, rushed appearances meant to convince the world everything is fine. But
risky for them to put Christina Quorum on the stand, I think.
There was so much being said about your client in that trial, obviously in the media, facing a number of different lawsuits. We also wondered whether or not he, and it's his decision alone, whether he wanted to take the stand and give his story, tell his story, give his version of events. Obviously, there are a ton of risks that come with putting a defendant on the stand, but it would be his choice. Was there a conversation about that?
Well, I mean, I can't get into, attorney-client privilege
Sure,
conversations. Obviously he thought about it, decided not to. And, as I indicated earlier, we thought the case had gone in really well for us. And so we liked where we were. So that was basically the decision.
Now, the big news, a lot of big news came out after the trial, was the firing of Maureen Comey, the lead prosecutor in this case. Now, there's obviously a political angle to it. There are comments that she has made. But I have to ask, you going head to head against her for so many weeks, months and before that, the firing of her, what did you make of that?
I think it was unfortunate. She's a very well-respected prosecutor. We had good sort of professional relationships with her during the course of the trial. And, I don't really think it had anything to do with the trial, but I can't really say anything beyond that. It just,
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough. Let's talk about something we can get into quite a bit. Let's talk bail. Okay, so we did a previous sidebar breaking down the defense's renewed motion for release, several arguments for why Sean Combs should be released on bail pending sentencing, acquitted of the most serious charges. There's no comparable case of someone who is convicted of the Mann Act alone and not engaging in sex trafficking or a prostitution for financial gain, and they would be locked up like this. Talked about the issues plaguing the MDC, how it is dangerous, how he's not a risk of flight, not a danger to the community. But do you think Judge Arun Subramanian is going to be persuaded by your letter, by your motion? Because obviously he specifically highlighted after the verdict your client's violence, how the defense asserted at trial that Combs was violent. Do you think he's going to have a change of opinion now based upon the legal papers?
Well, I think we certainly hope so. And, as we pointed out in the papers, the unfortunate violence that occurred was mostly a really long time ago, other than the one incident in June that Jane testified to, which was kind of unusual. They had been together for 3 years. There had been no violence, and she essentially started the fight. I'm not excusing anything, but it was kind of a one-off. And I think the government really hadn't put in any evidence of any recent violence. The Intercontinental video, remember, that was almost 10 years ago. He broke up with Cassie in 2018. And in our reply papers yesterday, we submitted a letter from Gina Hyun, who was one of the alleged victims, a different ex-girlfriend. And I think it was a pretty powerful letter about how Sean has changed, how she's not concerned about violence. She thinks he should be released on bail. So we're hoping that that will persuade the judge, given everything else, particularly, as you noted, like the really, really unusual nature of this particular Mann Act conviction and the fact that he's already been in prison, or jail rather, for like 11 months. This case—
You can hear the strain behind the words. You can see the tension in the jaw, the stiffness in the posture. Panic leaks through every gesture. They can't hide it anymore. Because the one person who was supposed to keep everything contained has dropped the shield and walked away. That's the moment the illusion shatters. Because legal teams don't abandon powerful people easily. They're paid to absorb the blows, to take the heat, to create distance, to craft narratives, to bury whatever needs burying. They are the backbone of every public figure who's built their world on control. But that backbone has snapped. And the message behind that snap is clear. Whatever's coming is too big to protect against. Behind closed doors, the panic is suffocating. Meetings stretch late into the night. Every phone call feels like a threat. Every knock on the door sounds like a warning. The figure paces, scrambles, snaps at assistants, demands explanations, demands options, demands solutions that don't exist anymore, because all the options they relied on for years, silencing, settling.
This is a one-off to begin with, but we're not aware of any case like this with a Mann Act conviction where anyone's done that much time to begin with. So.
And prosecutors, I'm imagining, have come back or will come back and say, well, listen, look, after the raids on his property, he engaged, or what they will say, he allegedly engaged in criminal activity and, obviously violence, they say, with Jane. But they say, look, what was in his hotel room when he was picked up in New York. They made allegations of what he was trying to do while he was in the MDC, whether it was using other inmates' phone privileges to have three-way phone calls. That was litigated before trial. What would be your response to say, you make the point that he is a changed person. The violence that was shown during the course of this trial is from years ago, but how would you convince the judge to say, listen, we are being truthful, we are being honest, we are being forefront, that he really is a different human being? Because the judge, again, this was right after the verdict and didn't have an opportunity for a briefing schedule. How can you make the argument that he is different and that he should be trusted?
Well, I think, the point you mentioned about the arrest, unfortunately, Sean has struggled with drug addiction for a long time. And I think one of the good things and positive things is that has come out of his incarceration. It's given him an opportunity, to rehabilitate. He's committed to continuing that. He's committed to a long-term program of therapy and helping with the domestic violence problem that he's had in the past. So, at a certain point, you have to just, maybe it is a leap of faith, but you have to just give a person another chance. And he really is committed to change and to there being a new chapter of service on his part. So, I think we have to hope that the judge will agree with that. And I think we've made a strong case for that.
Do you know when the judge might make a decision on bail?
We don't know.
Okay. If he denies release again, does that give you a sense of what sentencing could be like? Now, to be clear, my understanding is Judge Arun Subramanian even said at the point, if I make a decision on release, it's not indicative of where I'm leaning towards sentencing. I know there's a pre-sentencing investigation still being conducted or has been conducted. There's a lot of factors to consider. But I have to ask about whether this is going to, have an effect on sentencing. Do you believe it's going to have an effect on sentencing? Does it give you a preview of where the judge is lining up? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you are probably going to be arguing for time served, maybe a minimum of 21 to 27 months. Where do you think the judge is going to go here?
Yeah, I think that you have to take each step at a time and that the judge is not going to prejudge that. There's a lot more information he needs to get, not only the pre-sentence report, but we're going to make a very fulsome sentencing submission. And he's going to have, a much more detailed picture. Even, the trial was about the charges, right? And he doesn't have the full picture of all the factors about Sean's life that he's going to consider. There's going to be a big fight about the sentencing guidelines. We think actually we're going to end up arguing for an even lower guideline range than we had originally believed at the time of the verdict, where we didn't have we had like a couple of hours to try to figure out what to say about bail. So, I hope the judge will grant bail, but I feel confident that even if he doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to sentence Sean to time served. He's going to take everything into account when he gets all the submissions. And, I've got a lot of confidence that the judge is going to be fair and not prejudge the situation.
And you also have this motion for judgment of acquittal, that the Mann Act conviction,
redirecting, intimidating, delaying, are slipping out of their hands. The panic is real because the consequences are real. The cases that were once dismissed as noise are now hitting like a tidal wave. The patterns that were once brushed aside are suddenly impossible to ignore. And the stories that were once buried are clawing their way into the light. The lawyer saw it coming. The lawyer saw the trajectory, and instead of fighting it, they chose to save themselves. That choice sends one message: the fall is inevitable. And now the figure tries desperately to find someone, anyone, willing to step in. But nobody wants to touch it. Every potential replacement hesitates. Every conversation ends with a nervous pause. Nobody wants their name tied to something that is unraveling this quickly. Nobody wants to defend a sinking ship that has already swallowed too much water. Nobody wants to stand between the public and the truth that's finally clawing its way out. The panic grows because isolation grows. The circle around the figure has never been smaller. People who once bragged about
should be tossed out, Combs be granted at a minimum a new trial. Number of very interesting arguments that are present, and it's basically that there has really never been, as we've talked about, a prosecution conviction on a Mann Act like this, that Combs wasn't profiting off of the business. They were all consenting adults that were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking, that this isn't even prostitution per se, it's more voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but paid them for their time. They were all having a good time. There's a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were videotaped so he could watch them later. It's amateur pornography. There's an argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, but would never have come in if this was merely a prosecution for the Mann Act violations. Specifically, we talk about the Intercontinental Hotel footage. But couldn't the counter argument be, if you look at the text messages and voice notes and the travel, hotel, the payment documentation, that these charges, the Mann Act charges, could have been proven based on that evidence alone and not anything else about racketeering or sex trafficking?
Well, I think that goes, I don't agree with that. I think that, as we argued in the papers, the government didn't really show that the purpose of the travel was to have sex for money, and that in fact all the testimony and a lot of the other evidence showed that the men were being paid for their time. But even if we were wrong about that one, we have a number of the other arguments that you mentioned that really aren't undermined by those records. So for instance, one of our main arguments is that this statute, which used to be called the White Slave Traffic Act, it has this long history, but even with this long history, it's never been applied to a case like this. The term prostitution in a lot of states doesn't include this conduct, even if someone's being paid. If the person making the payment is paying essentially to observe other people having sex, that's not prostitution. So we've got the First Amendment argument, as you mentioned, and the new trial argument. So all of those arguments, I think, are independent of, the issue you raised, which, so we think we have a really strong motion. And so we're hoping the judge will agree. We'll see.
So just to be clear, I'll list out a couple of things that stood out to me when we were watching the trial. There was apparently this voice message that was played from Combs to Paul, right, one of the purported sex workers. Hit me up when you close. There was a voice message. Hey, Jess, I need to get him from Atlanta to here. Let me know. Hit me up. There was a message from, I think, Combs to Christina Coram. Can security bring me 5,000? There was another audio message to Jane. I sent you 15K, baby girl. There was another one to Frank Rodriguez. Frank, make sure that room is set up right. So in other words, you could look at this and say, and the argument is, even despite all that, it's paying people for their time. It's setting up, let's say, amateur pornography. What makes this not, because it always seemed that those charges were relatively straightforward, transporting people for the purposes of sex work. You're saying the intent was not sex work. That just so happened, whatever happened, happened, but the intent wasn't there. Just want to clarify that point.
Yeah, so that's one of the arguments. And then the other argument is just that it's more of a pure legal argument that prostitution only includes when you're paying someone to have sex with you, and he wasn't having sex with the males. So that's kind of a totally separate thing, even if you buy the government's argument that these payments were owed.
Their connection now distance themselves. People who once depended on their favor now avoid being seen with them. And the people who once enforced silence now whisper behind closed doors, planning their exits before the explosion hits. But the figure doesn't understand why. They've lived so long inside their own world, where fear was currency, where influence bent reality, where consequences were tools, not threats, that losing control feels impossible. But it's happening, slowly at first, then suddenly all at once. And now every move they make reveals how desperate they've become. You can see it in the frantic messaging, the late-night calls, the pacing behind tinted windows, the sudden disappearances from public spaces, the tightening of the inner circle until it's barely a circle at all. Behind the scenes, the fear grows with every new document, every new testimony, every new detail leaking into the world. The figure used to thrive on rumors, used them, manipulated them, weaponized them. But these aren't rumors anymore. These are patterns.
Ways for sex. And I do want to point out that, like, there's testimony and evidence that there were a number of occasions where the guys didn't end up having sex and they still got paid for their time. There's a bunch of text messages between Sean and people who work for Cowboys for Angels, one of the escort services, where, she's making clear that they dot all their I's and cross all their T's and that this isn't sex for money. So that's kind of his mindset. And the crime is transportation with the intent for the person being transported to engage in prostitution. So it's all sort of what's in his head and whether he's believing that he's paying, or arranging the transportation rather, in connection with prostitution. And then you get into sort of what is prostitution, and does it include, paying someone even if you're not the person who's going to have sex with them.
Let's say the motion for judgment of acquittal is not successful. Let's say the bail motion's not successful, and let's say your client is sentenced to a significant prison term, because there is discretion on the part of the judge. There's been a lot of talk in the news about this idea of a presidential pardon. Is the president really considering it? Have there been conversations with his team? Is there anything you can tell us about that?
Well, I don't really know. The trial team's not really involved in any of that. There's a lot of rumors floating around the internet and in the news media. So I can't really speak to it. It would make sense that the president, given his history, would be thinking about it for someone like Sean, but I can't really, I have no personal knowledge about that.
And if there is an unfavorable sentence, I imagine you would immediately appeal this conviction and sentence. What would be some of the arguments that would be made, if you can give us a preview, and and why you think they would be successful?
So I think Sean would almost definitely appeal if all of those things happen, which we hope won't. But it would be a lot of the same arguments that are in our post-trial motion that we've been talking about: the First Amendment, the argument about whether this actually was transportation to engage in prostitution, whether he should have, in light of the acquittals, he should get it in the alternative, a new trial where none of the evidence about the violence and the alleged racketeering would come in. Those would be, the principal arguments, I would imagine. Yeah,
if they didn't have racketeering or sex trafficking, you think they would have actually prosecuted him just for Mann Act violations?
I don't think so. It certainly would have violated Justice Department policy. I mean, the Justice Department policy for the past 75 years has been generally not to prosecute people other than people who are actually running prostitution rings to make money. And then on top of that, in more recent years, the only kinds of cases they've brought have been cases where they're alleging sex trafficking or other serious crimes. And at the beginning of this case, we made a selective prosecution motion. We argued that Sean was targeted because of his race, because this, with respect to the Mann Act in particular, because this was so unique. And one of the things they came back with is they said, well, we charged him with RICO and sex trafficking. And then they pointed to other cases involving white men where they had brought these other charges as well as the Mann Act. So
I know I have to let you go. Before I do, I just want to ask you one more question, because I know all of our viewers will be asking. What happened to victim 3? What happened to victim, I think, 5? There were other people that were supposed to be called by the prosecution, and there was a back and forth where the defense basically said, right, to the prosecution.
These are timelines. These are things that can't be brushed off as lies or jealousy or conspiracy. And with the lawyer gone, the figure doesn't have anyone left to organize the defense. Every misstep becomes a headline. Every reaction becomes evidence. Every desperate attempt to control the story becomes another crack in the facade. The panic isn't just emotional, it's strategic. Without guidance, the figure is exposed in ways they've never experienced before. The panic is visible now. Shaky interviews, forced laughter, defensive body language, hollow statements that sound more like pleas than denials, sudden absences followed by sudden appearances, random attempts to project confidence that only highlight the fear. People see it. People feel it. People know exactly what it means when someone who built their life on power starts shrinking under pressure. And behind that fear is something even more dangerous, the realization that their tactics don't work anymore. Intimidation doesn't work.
Minute break, which by the way, our guest Serena Townsend had said, hey, listen, I was asking, does any of this affect the judge's decision? In other words, does the judge just come in there, know what he's going to do? Is he persuaded by anything that anybody says in court? It's like, well, if they take a break, they go back, they may change their sentence. 5-minute break. I was like, oh, does that mean that he changed his sentence? Comes back, delivers this sentence, and it felt a little bit like a roller coaster. You kind of got an idea of where he was going and then not. And talk to us about how he started, what he said, and what the ultimate verdict was. And then we can get into a little bit about what the impact was in court, how people reacted to it. But what did the judge say exactly regarding the sentence?
Yeah, to your point, Jesse, it really was like a roller coaster because I didn't know where he was going, because he was starting by saying, I consider that you are an artist and a businessman and your work history are celebrated. And he used the words that Sean Combs' work history was also iconic. He says it's impressive given the early death of your father. Your work with inner city kids is commendable. There's no doubt that you are devoted to your family. So I think when he was saying those words, Jesse, I think he was really specifically talking about those impact letters and also seeing that 11-minute video about just all the extensive work that Sean Combs has done throughout his life outside of this federal case. And so the judge saying there's no doubt that you're devoted to your family, but the court knows that you do have problems with addiction, that drugs may have exacerbated your conduct over the years. So this was a moment where I was thinking, oh, well, maybe he'll be a little lighter on the sentence. That's what I was thinking. But then the judge said the court rejects the defense's narrative of the whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that this was just comes with the lifestyle of being an artist, a musician, a producer. The judge said you abused power and control over women who loved you. You used that abuse to get away, and the evidence of abuse in connection to freak-offs and hotel nights is massive. We saw the gashes and the bruises and the broken doors, and this is specifically talking about what Cassie had gone through throughout her, Cassie and Jane in that respect, throughout their relationships with Sean Combs, and that the judge said Jane and Cassie thought about both ending their lives, that these were very serious offenses. You plied Cassie with drugs. Your conduct went over for more than a decade. You were no John, but you were just more than that. And so then the judge is telling Sean Combs, well, you said you're sorry. One thing that strikes me is you brutally assaulted Jane. You punched, kicked her, slapped her so hard that she fell down. But I think when people think of this particular instance, well, the defense and the government say that this was one instance of physical violence when it came to Jane specifically. I think it's notable the timing of when this had happened. This had happened in June of 2024, just last year, but also notably after Cassie's lawsuit. This was after his homes were raided. This was after the video of him assaulting Cassie had leaked to CNN. And the judge said that even after he had physically assaulted Jane during this June 2024 incident, that he had said, and this was going by the court transcript, take this effing pill. You aren't going to ruin my effing night. You asked her also, is this coercive? And so I think from the judge's perspective, that was kind of a clear sign that the conduct has still been going on just pretty quickly or pretty recently. And so the judge also said these acts of sexual violence, substantial sentence must be given. So I was thinking maybe he would agree with the prosecution, possibly go for that 135 months. But he says he said, well, that's more than necessary. He said it's also not reasonable. And he said that the government's proposal doesn't take into consideration the mitigating factors, where it was the opposite for the defense, where the defense's proposal of pretty much being
work. Money doesn't work. Connections don't work. Because once the narrative starts cracking, once the people watching sense weakness, once the insiders start fleeing, the whole structure begins to collapse under its own weight. The cases haven't just gone too far for the lawyer. They've gone too far for the entire system that used to protect this figure. The legal clock ticks louder. The public watches closer. The inner circle fractures faster. And the figure spirals deeper into a panic that no amount of money or influence can soothe. They pace through dimly lit rooms, replaying every detail, every moment, every decision that led to this point. They lash out at the people still around, blaming everyone except themselves. They scramble to find new lawyers, new PR teams, new voices who can spin the narrative. But the people they approach aren't stupid. They know the difference between a manageable scandal and a catastrophic implosion. This one is the second. The panic grows because the figure knows what's coming, even if they don't say it out loud. Even if they pretend everything is fine, even if they try to stand tall, they feel the walls closing in. They feel the ground shifting. They feel the reality that they can't talk their way out of this one. And it shows. Sleep-deprived eyes, agitated movements, shorter sentences, snapped commands, nervous glances, constant checking of their phone, the inability to sit still for more than a few seconds, the sudden quiet in a house that used to be filled with noise. You can almost see the paranoia creeping in. Who's talking? Who's leaking? Who's flipping? Who's turning? Who's preparing their own defense by sacrificing them? They know loyalty only lasts as long as the power behind it. And the power is fading fast. The lawyer leaving was the first major signal. But the rest of the collapse is coming, piece by piece, layer by layer, until the figure stands stripped of everything they built their world around. And in that moment, the panic becomes more than fear, it becomes reality. The reality that this time, the storm is too big to escape. The reality that this time, the walls won't bend for them. The reality that this time, the darkness they created is swallowing them whole. So now they sit in silence, surrounded by the remnants of an empire they thought would last forever, listening to the ticking clock, waiting for the next headline, the next knock, the next piece of the truth that finally breaks through the last remaining wall. Because once the lawyer leaves, there's no turning back. There's no shield, no strategy, no defense, no protection. There's only the fall.